Hello everyone. In History 101, we are moving to an online format due to current circumstances. So I'll be doing a few lectures throughout the rest of the semester and posting them. They will show up on the final, so you might want to take some notes, and I'll try to make them brief so you're not sitting on the computer for too long. This week we'll be looking at the Renaissance and address, what makes the Renaissance different from the Middle Ages that we've been covering for the last 8 weeks. So let's get started. I did have, typically we would do, like we always do, some discussion questions, and but I'll skip these particular ones and I'll do some other ones later. But I do want you to note some of the changes that do take place. Number one of the biggest changes that we see is an economic shift. We begin to see places like Florence and in particular places like the Netherlands, Belgium, that area becomes the most important economic center of this particular age. Prior to this period, as you may recall in the Middle Ages, the Mediterranean was still probably the most significant economic market. But now, in this period, everything begins to kind of shift west and north. But here are some pages in case you want to look that up, because it might show up on the test. Now, number two, we do see some changes, but particularly for women, things don't change that much. Again, the book talks about that. I'm sure the quizzes address that too. As we noted with some of the examples from the Middle Ages, you always have exceptions to the rule. And we do see some women, such as Isabel de Este, who is a renowned woman at this age and does some kind of great stuff in regards to leadership. But for the most part, the expectations for women have not changed much in the Renaissance, which again makes us question, is there really a Renaissance if life has not improved for a good group of people? And then lastly, one change that we begin to see is within the church. Not sure if it's a Renaissance because people have challenged the church since the Middle Ages, but we do begin to see people reading the Bible on their own. There's a few movements that that the reading talks about in regards to certain groups that begin to kind of question the legitimacy of the church, the Catholic Church at this point. But again, that's no different from what we saw in the Middle Ages. So let's start by looking at some of the changes that do take shape. Understand that the Renaissance is really an elite movement. It's really for those who either are of noble classes or are part of this new growing class called the bourgeois. All right. So when it comes to the Renaissance, there is some kind of similarities from the old Middle Ages to today to the Renaissance. You still have this kind of separation of those who work, those who fight, those who pray, but it's beginning to kind of shift a little. So you do have these kind of major estates. The book talks about this. You have the clergy. The second estate are the nobles. They're still in power, but as the reading kind of noted, they begin to lose power, partly because cities are growing. Bourgeois are entering the different forms of government, and they're the ones who are governing. So there is where we see a particular change happen. One kind of shift that we see with the nobles is that with the introduction of gunpowder, they become to some extent useless. Remember that they were established in the Middle Ages to protect the community, the village and serfs. But with the introduction of gunpowder, those skills that they had are no longer relevant in the new type of warfare. So, anybody can take up some kind of gun or if not cannon and shoot that without, these skills that the nobles used to have back in the Middle Ages. So they take on a new role. The reading talks about this, how they focus more on their education, on still kind of practicing their military exercises, but they do it mostly for show. If you ever look at armor from the Renaissance and you compare that to the Middle Ages, their armor is much more decorative than armor from the Middle Ages because they wore it mostly for like parades or just to kind of show off. If you ever go to the Tower of London, you would see old armor from Henry VIII, Henry VII, and it is very intricate in the etching within the armor. So there you do see a bit of a difference. And as I noted, the new noble class, they're more focused on having an education than being that old kind of thug warriors that we talked about during the Middle Ages. And then at the bottom of the society, you have everybody else. One thing that we do begin to see as a shift, so compared to, say, the Middle Ages, is we have a population that's much more urban than previous generations. So that is something that's kind of changing. And then another kind of major difference is that you have the new emerging bourgeois class, as you saw with the video, the Medicis, that first episode that you were assigned. So there we do see a difference. And this kind of graph just shows you the new kind of hierarchy that's in place. As you can see, the bottom part, it's just the majority of people. They don't see much of a difference from one age to the other. So had they been alive in the Middle Ages and gone into the Renaissance, they would have said life has not changed much. So what makes, where is this difference in the Renaissance, right? And what distinguishes one era from the other? Understand that this is sometimes social critics or historians that kind of look back and give these names. For this example, it was Petrarch who gave the name to the Renaissance, right? So there are some differences. One of them is the shift from the medieval world to a neoclassic world, where they are heavily influenced by Greek and Roman culture, and we see that in their architecture. As you kind of see these buildings here, they're kind of looking back to Rome and Greece and trying to recreate it. And we're all guilty of that. We do that today, where we look at certain historical periods and say, wow, I wish I was alive in the 1920s or the 1950s, and we tend to romanticize them, even though they were probably not that good to begin with, but we look at them as some special period in time. So yeah, they're all looking back to Greece and Rome. They look at their age, the Renaissance, 1400s, as an age of light compared to the Middle Ages. I think it's Petrarch who kind of came up with this notion that the Middle Ages was a time of darkness, hence terms like the Dark Ages. And their period is moving into an age of enlightenment. And again, all these things could be argued one way or the other, but that's from their perspective. And then, as I noted earlier, for most people, you would never see much of a difference, right? For most people, life kind of just continued. Some ideas that do emerge that are different, and this one's quite key, and the book talks about this one too, is individualism. People really begin to focus on this concept of individual ability, and we'll see that in a little while when we look at I can't remember his name. When we'll look at some of the readings. So individual qualities begin to separate from this notion of the community, which is something that we see in the Middle Ages, where everybody's dependent upon each other in these small villages. Individual ability really begins to stand out. However, I did argue that the Middle Ages did have elements of this. Another important difference between the Middle Ages and this Renaissance period is secularism. People begin to focus more on the natural world, the real world, whereas the Middle Ages was focused on the supernatural, with God always interceding in people's lives. People believing that the Black Death was caused by God's wrath. The Renaissance focused more on the ability to use nature and understand it, not from a spiritual sense, but from a natural sense, and this kind of gives birth to the scientific era. So they focus more on the real world rather than on the spiritual. That doesn't mean that they stop addressing God or things like that, but definitely there is a bit of a shift there. So some ideas that emerge that, again, that are brand new are this notion of humanism. And humanism is something that we do as historians. We've been doing that in this class, right? Most of the questions that I ask focus on you rationalizing ideas, reading them, thinking logically, rather than just saying, oh, it's God, right? So that becomes an important shift in the way people begin to look at the world. And one important thing is understanding the concept of civic humanism, where people believe that everybody has a role in society. So even though a class like this might not be significant to your career, it is important because you are still, at the end of the day, a citizen of this nation. So you might be thinking, why do I have to take History 101? Well, outside of your job, you do have to vote, right? You do have to make decisions that impact other human beings. So humanism kind of allows you to think beyond just the scope of your task, the scope of your job, and think critically of how policy impacts people's lives. So civic humanism really kind of focus on this notion of somebody being well educated, right? Because you will be making decisions. And in doing so, it makes you a better person. So it's great that you know everything there is to know about engineering, but what do you know about policy? What do you know about different human rights, right? Engineering ideas, formulas might not transfer over to some of these social issues that impact society. So having a well-rounded education, knowing engineering, but also knowing philosophy, history, sociology, all these different other fields makes you a better citizen. And at this time, it's just men who got this education, right? And also we begin to see society moving away from a feudal system, hence the Middle Ages, to a republic. A republic is like the United States, where people do have a representing body that represents their voice. So Italy is probably the best example of where this is happening. The book talks about these two men, so I won't spend too much time, but it talks about Lorenzo Valla, where, again, they're kind of looking back at Rome as the golden age for many of them. And Marsilio Ficino, who kind of reintroduces Italy to some of these ancient writings. The Middle Ages, again, focus a lot on Christianity, Christian writers, such as The City of God that we read. And some of these, what they would consider pagan writers, at least in the Middle Ages, had essentially disappeared. So a lot of these thinkers, what they're doing is retranslating them in the vernacular so people can read them. And as the video noted, right, people begin to look at plays about Plato and Aristotle and things like that. So it is an exciting time to be alive. All right, I want to stop here. I will post a discussion question because I do want you to read Machiavelli's, that's his name, Machiavelli's The Prince, and address a few questions just because this is such an important reading that I want you to discuss. All right, so I'll stop it here and then come back because I'm going to talk about Machiavelli, Petrarch, and then finish up this lecture.